When Vladimir Putin launched the Ukraine invasion, he thought that the war he started would be as simple as could be. Russia would storm in with tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers, forcing Ukraine to capitulate. Even when that didn't happen, Putin assumed that he had the full support of his people and that he could grind Ukraine down over time. What Russia's leader never expected was that some of his own people would turn against him. But that's what's happening in occupied Ukraine and in much of Russia, as resistance forces are teaching Putin that he can never predict from where the next strike will come. Putin is losing control as a secret and unmanageable war erupts in Russia. In a December 2nd report, Euromaidan Press reveals that Russia has a major problem with resistance movements. Hiding in the shadows and constantly waiting for their chances to strike, these movements contain Ukrainians in occupied regions of their own country and Russians who are willing to fight against Putin on his turf. These movements are dangerous, effective, and they've been carrying out attacks inside Russia against which Putin and his traditional army have no defense. Even Russia's own intelligence services seem to be helpless as the attacks spread from Melitopol to Moscow, Euromaidan Press reports. And it's not just that Russia is being struck on its own turf, it's that these attacks appear to be coordinated, suggesting that the underground resistance has grown to the point where it's now virtually impossible for Putin to contain. A spate of strikes by partisans throughout November has revealed just how extensive this network of resistance fighters has become, and it all starts in Melitopol. There, Euromaidan Press says a group of partisans attempted to detonate a vehicle that was carrying a Russian drone crew as they traveled to take part in an operation. Unfortunately for Ukraine, this was one of the few strikes that its resistance fighters failed to complete, as the drone crew survived due to the car failing to detonate. But it's not like this is the only effort made by Ukrainian partisans in Melitopol. The region, which Russia has held almost from the moment that Putin launched his invasion, is an absolute hotbed for resistance activity. Back in October 2023, saboteurs proved that the car explosion strategy can work, as they managed to pull it off, killing several Russian occupiers. The Express reported on the strike at the time, noting that Russia tried to claim a short circuit had led to the incident. That wasn't the case at all. The partisans were doing their part, even 2 years ago. Russia knows it has a resistance problem in the Ukrainian region. In June, Pravda reported that Russia had announced the sentencing of a family living in the region on charges of collaborating with Ukraine and carrying out a railway sabotage operation. That capture represented one of the very few successes that Russia has enjoyed against Ukraine's partisans. Russia handed out sentences ranging from 20 years to life to the 3 resistance fighters, but it clearly wasn't enough to stop other Melitopol partisans from carrying on with their operations. The November car bombing may have failed, but it set the tone for a month that Putin will want to forget as soon as possible. Just days later, saboteurs operating in occupied Luhansk struck, and they had far more success. The partisans were operating in a part of Ukraine over which Russia claims almost total control, but that didn't stop them. The underground fighters managed to plant explosives under 2 Russian vehicles, both of which were detonated at precisely the right moments. 4 of Russia's soldiers were killed in the blasts, showcasing just how entrenched Ukraine's partisans have become in regions that Russia believes that it controls. What happened in Luhansk in November is eerily similar to an underground operation carried out in the Kherson region back in May. The Kyiv Independent reported that another car bombing had managed to kill 4 pro-Russian troops, this time targeting Chechen officers operating in the region. We're starting to see a pattern here, and it's one that suggests that Ukraine's underground fighters have become extremely well-versed in identifying key Russian vehicles and, even more importantly, accessing them for long enough to plant explosives that take out Russia's soldiers. The incidents in occupied Ukraine weren't over for Putin. In Crimea, infiltrators accomplished another mission, which was far different from those seen in Melitopol and Luhansk. Euromaidan Press explains, stating, Ukrainian infiltrators in Crimea recorded fighter jets taking off from Saki airbase, giving Ukrainian intelligence real-time visibility into Russian flight patterns. These kinds of intelligence operations are just as vital to Ukraine as the missions that result in the immediate deaths of Russian troops. Now that Ukraine knows what jets are stationed at Saki, it also knows what Russia may deploy the next time that Ukraine launches a drone assault against the Crimean Peninsula. Alternatively, Ukraine now has very specific targets. Who knows, we may find ourselves reporting on a successful Ukrainian missile and drone strike on the Saki airfield in the coming weeks, thanks to this information. The coordinated nature of these types of secretive operations becomes clearer when you consider what they achieve for Ukraine. Whenever a Russian vehicle explodes, taking soldiers or officers with it, Russia has to redo its strategic calculus. Troops that may have been committed to an upcoming assault are gone, meaning Russia has to move soldiers around to carry out the assault. Either the soldiers don't get moved, meaning the assault doesn't happen, or they do, which leads to another assault being delayed or cancelled. Ukraine wins either way. And the more of these sabotage operations that are successful, the greater the disruption caused to the Russian war effort. Throw information-gathering operations like those seen in Crimea into the mix, and you get a sense that Ukraine's intelligence organizations are working with the partisans. After all, how would these underground groups know what type of information Ukraine wants, or how to get that information to the armed forces, if there was no connection between the likes of HUR and the partisans? Another wrinkle is added, demonstrating that Putin's problem with resistance movements is far larger and more complex than he ever anticipated. Still, if these types of operations stayed inside Ukraine, Putin could deal with their existence. He wouldn't be happy about them, but he might also expect that Ukrainians in occupied territories would band together to wreak havoc on Russian logistics and military operations. Putin's problem is that the partisans aren't restricted to occupied Ukraine. They're operating inside Russia too, and that means that some of Putin's own people are actively betraying him to help Ukraine. During the same month that the trio of operations we've discussed was being carried out in occupied Ukraine, resistance members inside Russia were carrying out their own operations. On November 5th, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, or SSO, had confirmed that a transport loading vehicle that Russia uses to transport Iskander ballistic missiles had been blown up in Kursk. The operation took place the day prior, and it wasn't the SSO itself that carried out the destruction. Instead, it was a Russian partisan group named Black Spark that did the damage in an operation designed to make it much harder for Russia to launch any of its stockpile of around 600 Iskanders at Ukraine from the border regions. Euromaidan Press adds that the partisans, presumably also members of Black Spark, also took out a Harmonier radar that supports local air defenses in the same region at the same time. Again, we see a coordinated approach to the underground resistance and its attacks. Taking out a transport vehicle weakens Russia's ability to carry out aerial strikes against Ukraine. Meanwhile, the destruction of a radar makes it harder for Russia's air defenses to stop Ukraine's drones and missiles from entering Kursk. That opens up opportunities for Ukraine's forces to carry out more successful strikes in the region, or to take advantage of a newly opened aerial corridor that they can use to fly through Kursk on their way to targets deep inside Russia. Every attack is connected to Ukraine's attempts to weaken the Russian war machine from within. Just as the failed car bombing in Melitopol was a sign of things to come in occupied Ukraine, the sabotage in Kursk signaled the beginning of yet more secretive strikes inside Russia. Just 4 days after the news broke of the Kursk operations, Pravda reported that Ukrainian partisans had managed to destroy 4 military logistics facilities in the Bashkortostan and Volgograd regions of Russia. The series of arson attacks, which began in October and carried on into November, took out a trio of communications towers in the former region and a railway relay cabinet in the latter. Russia's logistical networks were the obvious targets here. The country relies on railways to cart troops and equipment around Russia and into Ukraine. The destruction of a relay cabinet, though only creating a temporary setback, is enough to cause the same type of disruption we mentioned with the car bombing earlier. Losing communications towers also makes it harder for Russia's forces to coordinate on their own territory, which manifests in weakened assaults in Ukraine. These are just isolated incidents. As Euromaidan Press reports, Putin and his cronies are dealing with an ever-increasing wave of these types of underground strikes, and he has absolutely no answer for them. In another wave of incidents stretching from Moscow to Irkutsk, electrical panels, relay boxes, and railway infrastructure were set on fire, with local officials describing the incidents as unexplained technical failures. The last line tells you everything you need to know about how Russia is attempting to handle what is happening on its territory right now. Frankly, it's not doing much at all. Rather than confronting the problem, Russia lies about its existence, and it expects the Russian people to simply bury their heads in the sand on Putin's command. However, with these acts of sabotage becoming so common, it's getting harder for the Kremlin to hide away from the fact that Ukraine has an extremely active underground network of supporters inside Russia that is also very effective at what they do. Let's come back to the Moscow incident. That city is Russia's capital, which would presumably make it the one city upon which Putin focuses the majority of the efforts the Kremlin is making to catch the partisans in the act. But if that's the case, those efforts are failing. On November 1st, the Kyiv Independent reported that HUR completed a devastating drone strike against the Ring pipeline, which is responsible for transporting up to 3 million tons of jet fuel, along with millions of tons of gasoline and diesel every single day. This strike was conducted using drones, the Kyiv Independent says, which suggests that the many partisans operating inside Russia had nothing to do with it. However, Euromaidan Press links this strike to infiltrators operating inside Moscow. Perhaps those infiltrators didn't carry out the strikes themselves. Instead, they may have done something similar to the partisans operating in Crimea by providing HUR with photographs and information that enabled the drone attack upon which the Kyiv Independent reports. We don't know for sure, but that's the point. Russia doesn't know either, and Putin will be tearing out what remains of his hair as he tries to figure out how to deal with shadowy forces that are outside of his grasp, wreaking havoc inside Russia. What Putin doesn't want to admit, though it's staring him right in the face, is that Russia's main problem isn't that these underground groups exist. They've been around since the beginning of his invasion. The much larger problem is that these groups are growing, meaning that what we saw in November is worse than what was happening just a year before. And as the resistance continues to grow, the operations conducted in Russia and occupied Ukraine in November will look like child's play compared to the coming spate of sabotage and information gathering that will affect Russia in the future. Resistance to Putin is now a way of life for many in Russia, as Euromaidan Press explains. The spread of sabotage from Moscow to the Urals mirrors the growing anti-government mood in separatist circles, but here the motivation is not independence, but direct opposition to the war. These are Russians who take personal risks to attack their own state, still limited in number, but appearing with increasing frequency. Russia's rear, once thought safe from Ukrainian attacks, has now grown increasingly vulnerable. If it's not long-range drones and missiles destroying refineries, it's Putin's own people carrying out acts of sabotage that threaten the very existence of the Russian war effort. Frankly, Putin should have seen this all coming. Back in March 2024, Novaya Gazeta's Ada Blakewell wrote an article for Vox Europe, in which she pointed out that Putin's focus on exiling, imprisoning, and outright murdering the more vocal critics of the Kremlin has led to his ignoring the very real underground resistance forming in Russia. That resistance started small. Future partisans wore green ribbons and communicated online to express their anger at Putin's actions in Ukraine. But over time, Blakewell writes, this wellspring of discontent evolved. Those wearing green ribbons found themselves creating underground workshops for a growing movement of saboteurs. The online forums became printing houses dedicated to spreading the word about what was really happening in Ukraine. Little by little, a movement was growing. Blakewell had the opportunity to meet some of these resistance fighters, noting that they were using technologies such as 3D printing create what they needed for their operations. Many of the members of the resistance took part in cyber espionage, while others organized lectures. They were not necessarily the partisans that would later organize sabotage attacks against Russian assets, but they were still important. Increasingly common underground resistance groups offer safe haven to those who want to fight the regime without having to sacrifice their freedom, Blakewell wrote in 2024. It wouldn't be long before the more active-minded of these types of groups started taking matters into their own hands. Putin failed to do anything about these types of philosophy-focused movements, either because he didn't take them seriously or because he didn't know they existed. But by February 2025, Ukraine had developed a full-blown shadow army inside the areas of Ukraine occupied by Russia's forces. An extensive network of civil resistance activists, partisans, and military special forces units currently operates throughout Russian-occupied Ukraine, conducting everything from information campaigns to sabotage operations, the Atlantic Council wrote in February. That movement was active in regions like Crimea and Luhansk, both of which were targets of action in November. The networks were also growing to the point where they were actively working alongside HUR and other Ukrainian intelligence organizations to make their efforts as effective as possible. The same types of movements were growing in Russia, as we've already learned. Now, Ukraine is in a position where it has an army of people who aren't official parts of its military, but are capable of conducting operations that the active military can't conduct. Ukraine's forces would have to break through Russian lines to do damage in areas like Melitopol and Luhansk. Partisans can do that damage for Ukraine because they're already in those regions. The Russians who support Ukraine do the same on Putin's home turf, attacking parts of the Russian war machine in places that would require Ukraine to conduct a full-blown invasion to target otherwise. Again, Putin failed to do anything about the growth of these movements. Now he's realizing quickly that Ukraine has Russia outgunned in the shadow war that is engulfing Russia and the occupied regions of Ukraine. That's according to a November 27th article by AKLED, which says that the once isolated acts of domestic sabotage in Russia have evolved into a proxy war. The organization charts the kind of sabotage operations being carried out inside Russia throughout the war. The first year saw a spate of arson attacks targeting recruitment officers, with AKLED suggesting that these attacks may have been more self-serving than they appear. A Russian can't be forced into Putin's army if the recruiters trying to snatch them off the streets no longer have an office, the logic goes. But as the nature of the sabotage operations has evolved, so have the motivations behind these kinds of attacks. Fast forward to 2025, and AKLED highlights the partisan group Artesh as a driving force for Ukraine's shadow operations in the occupied territories. That group had conducted around half of the 30 or so sabotage operations conducted in these territories in 2025 alone. In Russia itself, groups like Freedom of Russia operate in a similar manner to Artesh. Alongside the Russian Volunteer Corps, Freedom of Russia is now focused on hitting key sites in its own country hard. Like Artesh, it's mostly involved in blowing up or setting fire to rail and telecommunications equipment, such as cell towers. The two groups likely take advantage of their ability to slip through the border undetected by virtue of their Russian citizenship, which was imposed on residents of Crimea in 2014, Akhlet claims. Putin's enforced Russification of occupied Ukraine appears to have come back to bite him. Ultimately, what we saw throughout November was the war behind the war. As all of the headlines are grabbed by Russia's latest airstrikes, Ukraine's own long-range drones, and the stumbling peace negotiations being overseen by the US, Ukraine's shadow army of partisans, volunteers, and freedom fighters quietly go about their business. And that business is doing everything in their power to undermine the Russian war effort. Such groups won't ever conduct attacks so large that they stop the Ukraine war in its tracks. That's not the goal. What they do is inflict damage at inopportune moments, slowly bleeding Russia's military resources while disrupting the carefully laid plan of the country's officers and commanders. Along the front, resistance groups are disrupting logistics, collecting intelligence, and forcing Russian units to divert manpower away from combat, Euromaidan Press says. In the deep rear, strikes against railways, communications, and energy infrastructure expose structural weaknesses that Moscow cannot secure without further stretching its forces. This powerful combination doesn't just harm Russia's attempts to wage war. It reveals to Putin that opposition to his brutal invasion is larger than he thinks. To an authoritarian like Putin, that opposition is terrifying. The Freedom of Russia Legion, which we've just mentioned, has become one of the biggest thorns in Putin's side. Earlier in November, that group's members, backed by Ukrainian intelligence, carried out a series of daring strikes across Russia, crippling locomotives as they went. You can find out more about these strikes if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos examining the war from within that Putin has failed to stop. And thank you for watching.